What's that screeching sound? Is it the warbling metallic voice back once more? What does Tate have in store for Jeff and Cierra? Will they share his faith and join his righteous cause? This week we find out the answer to at least one of those questions. I'm your narrator, Chad, and this is episode 11, chapter 15 of No Evil. Let's escape. The pages of the calendar had turned many times in the room. Weeks, months, years seemed to pass by without much notice. The plastic over the windows yellowed with age. At one time the dank, mildewy smell of the room overpowered him. Now he didn't notice it. The calendar said January 1988, but it didn't mean anything to him. Time was irrelevant in the room. His first memories of this place were of watching his mother do laundry. He faintly remembered staring up at her. She was piling clothes into machines that looked enormous and frightening. When he thought about it, he could still smell the detergent. The first time he remembered being sent to the room, he dropped a glass of milk on the floor. After a good swat for that, he was locked inside. He was only in there for maybe an hour at the longest. He remembered his mother coming to get him, looking over her shoulder like it was imperative that she not be seen. He thought of the forthwith sense of relief when the door swung open and he was allowed to exit. It had been a long time since he had that feeling. With each punishment, the sentence grew longer. With every plea for forgiveness, he got a lecture in scripture. It went that way for years, until it didn't. One day they just never came to let him out. He sat in soiled clothes for days, scared he'd die there. Then there was a tap at the door and it opened. His mother appeared for a moment. The door was cracked just enough to lean in. She didn't dare look at him. She bent over, set a bowl of oatmeal and a glass of water on the floor and left. The lock clicked. With not much else of note to remember since then, he recalled it all quite vividly. Now there were no machines and no visits outside of dinner. The tap where he washed the stink off himself and his own imagination were his only comforts. Sometimes he wondered what the streets really looked like without the cloak of yellowed plastic. In the past he imagined himself going out, meeting a friend, playing ball and sipping ice-cold lemonade. Lemonade was his favorite. But outside the room, things couldn't be trusted. The noise of the street changed over time. The laughter of children disappeared. He couldn't tell if they'd gone or if it was just drowned out. He found out later that the small suburb had boomed with commuters from the city. More and more people brought more and more cars, and soon the sound of vehicles passing by was pretty much the only sound there was. On a daily basis, he could hear the whine of sirens and the growl of engines as they accelerated nearby. In the end, none of that mattered either. All that mattered in the room, and therefore all that mattered in the world, was the word, and Tate O'Byrne knew it line for line. There was only one book in the room, no television, no windows, no distractions, and all the time to read it. And that's what he did. He read and he read, marveling at the grace and wisdom and power of his heroes. The stories generated a maelstrom of wonderment inside him, made him ache for an adventure beyond these four walls. He sat on his cot with his arms folded around his knees. The sky was bright. Tate guessed it was the middle of the day, but a dreary gray through the plastic. On this day, Tate was grateful to be inside. The walls were thin, and the cold pierced them, the rising wind forcing itself through small cracks of open space around the window. The street was silent at last. The only sound in the room was the steady dripping of the tap. Tate got up and tightened the faucet by hand, but it continued to drip. He sighed. It was just a reflex. He knew there was no use in trying to tighten it. He tried it all before. He plopped back down on his cot and continued to study the blurred gray sky. Tate closed his eyes, ready to let the day fade away in sleep. Then the silence was obliterated.
"You can't do this. It's wrong,"
his mother was shouting. That was nothing new. Their fights were a nearly daily occurrence, and always started the same way. His mother would ask his father for some money to buy groceries. He would accuse her of pissing it away on lottery tickets and cigarettes. She would say she hadn't. It would always escalate. In the end, she would cry and admit to doing the thing she hadn't. This time, the tone in her voice seemed different.
You can't, please.
There was a loud thump at the door. He could hear his mother's pleas sharpen as the pitch of her voice rose. She was terrified. Tate got up and quickly ran to the door. It thumped again.
What's going on?
He said. It came out as a whisper, and he realized it had been months since he last spoke. He cleared his throat, swallowed, and spoke again. Again, there was no answer.
Stop. Just stop. You're drunk.
What's happening? He wants to know what's happening. You hear that? Then the knob was turning. The door swung open with such force that the knob punctured the wall, and the door held itself open. His father was standing in the doorway, a bottle in hand. How old are you now, son? He asked, with a big drunken grin on his face. Tate's mother stood behind, and she looked worriedly at him. Her high-pitched appeals softened.
Can you please just come have some lunch?
Lunch? Do I fucking look like I want lunch? He said, taking a big swig from the bottle. I wanted to let you out. Your ever-loving mother here wants you to stay in here.
That's not...
His mother couldn't finish the sentence. As soon as she began to speak, Tate's father spun and delivered a hateful fist to her jaw. She dropped to the ground in a heap. The sound of the fall was something Tate had never heard. His stomach churned, and what little color he had drained from his face. Cierra struggled to fall asleep. She knew her mother would be worried sick. You're going to get taken, or worse one of these days. That was her mother's refrain every time she went out. She could almost hear it now. She'd pull up in a cab and get out ready for bed, and instead she'd get a hot breakfast of shouting. What a way to ease into a hangover. Now she was out with one stranger, taken by another, and sleeping in a creepy house in the woods. Her mother was starting to make a lot of sense. She tossed and turned on the pull-out couch, and the springs moaned loudly. Outside, the lights clicked on, and it shone in through the thin curtains. A low, grinding noise rumbled just beyond the front door, and Cierra raised the blanket over her eyes, and tears began to flow again.
Oh, why the hell would you let them talk you into coming here?
Yes, Mother, I know I make bad decisions. The grinding noise intensified outside the door, so that it could no longer be ignored. She sat up, and something clanged just beyond the threshold of the front door. She shook Jeff violently, but he wouldn't wake.
Jeff? Jeff, wake up!
He didn't move. Overcome with the dreadful thought he might be dead, Cierra put a hand on his chest. It eased in and out gently, and she relaxed. The sound stopped. Cierra was pumping blood, her heart thudding to the point where she started to feel faint. She stood and took a deep breath, then tiptoed to the window. The outside lights clicked on, again basking the entire front yard in bright fluorescence. She pulled back the blinds and immediately reeled back. Jeff could have just as easily went back to sleep. The screeching sounds outside infiltrated his dreams and had him fixing 100 rusty bike chains. He barely registered that they were real. Cierra rushing in shattered that thin veil, and his mind and reason filtered slowly back through a lazy river of beer. On the lawn, the rusted metal faces smiled and frowned in cycles. Animal sculptures dug channels through the lawn with iron paws. At the door stood a 6-foot-tall wrought-iron scarecrow. It had a human skull welded and polished in fine detail. Its metal jaws hung with a rakish smile. It raised one finger to its mouth and signaled Cierra to hold her tongue. She obliged, but not willingly. She had no voice to scream. The large iron turtle waddled into the light. It no sooner came into view than a large sheet metal-lined cat pounced on it. The cat began tearing at the turtle's sides and flipped it over. A piercing squeal rose up from the turtle as it was torn apart in metal agony. The iron scarecrow continued to smile. Cierra took 2 steps back from the door, and she could see its shadow tip a non-existent cap to her. A hand fell on her shoulder, and she wheeled around with her arms flailing. Her voice finally snapped back to her, and she wailed in a pitch she'd never heard herself make before. Her eyes had been closed in fear, and when she opened them, she saw Jeff looking startled, his hands wrapped around her wrists.
Don't go out there!
Cierra bawled. What the hell was that sound? What's going on? He made a motion to walk toward the window, and Cierra grabbed his arm, tugging it in the opposite direction. Jeff could see the outline of someone standing at the door, eyes cast downward. He pushed aside the curtain, and the iron scarecrow raised its head and glared at him. Then it raised one fist and began to bang at the door. Knock, knock. Jeff pulled back from the window, and without saying a word, he fled to the stairs. Cierra grabbed at him as he went by, but he pushed her aside. The stairs croaked in quick beats. Upstairs, the house was just as open, and as soon as Jeff got to the last step, he was standing in Tate's bedroom. "Oh, burn!" Tate was laying on his back, his arms in the air. His body quivered and darted from side to side like he was having a seizure. He was laying on top of the blankets, fully dressed. Jeff took a step toward the bed, but he saw Tate's car keys sitting on a table a few steps from the top of the stairs. He snatched them and turned back down. Cierra was standing on the last step facing the front door. The iron scarecrow waited patiently for someone to answer. Jeff was fiddling with the keys. There must have been 20 of them, trying to find the one that would fire Tate's sedan. He nearly bowled over Cierra as he came to the bottom, but she heard him coming and stepped aside at the last second.
What's happening?
"We're getting the fuck out of here. This is too much crazy for one day." He started toward the front door, seemingly forgetting about a certain 6-foot man without a brain, then beelined for the kitchen. Adjacent to the refrigerator was another door. It led to the backyard, and would mean they'd have to find a way around without being seen by the vacant metal eye sockets. It was pitch black there, and it seemed still. Jeff gripped the knob.
"What are you doing?"
The voice made Cierra's heart sink. Tears flowed down her face again, and she wiped them away. For the first time since it happened, she became acutely aware of the burns on her face. The tears stung, and the back of her hand was covered in soot. "We are getting the fuck out of here," Jeff said.
"You can't go."
The hell I can't. I'm not staying here to be fish food for your metal pets.
The comment made Tate pause.
"What?"
Jeff pointed to the door. The iron scarecrow was still sitting in place. Tate marched over directly and swung the door open. Out front he saw years' worth of work, strung out all over the yard. Some pieces had been torn apart. Others seemed to have dragged themselves from one spot to another.
What's happened?
"You tell us. Actually, save it. We're going." Tate stood in his doorway, stunned. The lawn looked like a battlefield, or a jungle. All at once, the dream flooded back to him. He'd been having a nightmare. Lost in the jungle, animals were trying to tear him apart. In their haste to get him, they trampled over one another, bit at and tore the flesh from one another. Then they gorged on one another. Tate stuck his hand in his pocket and felt the marker. Jeff tried to push past Tate, but Tate grabbed his shoulder tightly.
"You can't go."
"Let go of me, O'Byrne, you little sniveling." Jeff stopped mid-sentence as Tate's grip tightened and became unbearable. The fingers stabbed into him like well-greased pistons firing in a hot engine. His nails dug in and burned with hot pain.
"You will stay."
Cierra pulled out a drawer and dumped it. Seeing only a pile of dishcloths, she grabbed the next one, found it was full of cutlery, and grabbed a sharp steak knife.
You let him go.
Tate turned to Cierra and let go of Jeff's shoulder. Jeff saw Tate move toward her, and he pulled back his fist through the pain and struck Tate a powerful blow to the back of the head. He stumbled. Cierra held the knife out to keep him at bay, but Tate suddenly grabbed it by the blade and tore it from her shaking hands. Tate turned with a sneer that seemed to have weight. Jeff stumbled back as if he'd been hit by a powerful gust of wind. Suddenly Tate's mind was transfixed on Jeff. A boiling brew of hatred swirled in his mind, every slight against him. Every snarky comment radiated out of his soul, every desire to inflict pain, every scintillating dream of revenge. Each thought was swept up in the rising tide. Tate was abruptly assaulted with the blaring rage of one focused thought, the satisfying sound of an aluminum bat connecting with a softball. Tink. Jeff staggered and fell. A river of blood spewed from his temple, and Cierra squealed before charging at Tate. Cierra's body lifted off the ground and twisted unnaturally in the air, rotating her torso as if she were a wet cloth being wrung out. Then she dropped to the floor, heaping up against Jeff. His fury fading, Tate began to panic.
"Sin, prison, sin, prison."
The trumpeting sound of his own fearful thoughts.
No, not dead, not dead, not dead."
Tate knelt beside Jeff's limp body, put a hand on Cierra's blood-soaked hair, and, sobbing, cradled them. That's all for episode 11, chapter 15 of No Evil. If you're enjoying the podcast, let us know what you think in the comments. Give us a like, a share, a maison derrière. Do all the social media things. Become an escapist by subscribing and clicking the bell. And you know what else you can do? You can take a walk on the wild side and forget about Sunday brunch with the in-laws so you can fork out $0 and use your library card to borrow a 2014 model Kobo and listen to AV Escapes, now available on Audible. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you at the next escape.